We all have to do some kind of work, and we've all had to work ever since we stopped hunting and gathering, and probably many people considered hunting and gathering work then. But is work something we have to do to earn our leisure in society, or is it rather more fundamental a human urge than that? Today I'm joined by Professor Jan Lucassen, who has just finished a comprehensive history of work through all human societies across time, and he's going to tell me more of this substantial subject. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Jan, welcome to the Future Imperfect podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here. Would you introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
Well, I'm a historian, and I've written a book about the history of work from prehistory onwards, so from the beginning of humankind until now. And why have I done so? Because it's not just something that you do in a lazy afternoon. I've done so because of curiosity. I've always been intrigued by work and by working people, mainly, I think, because it fills most of our time. It's the most important occupation that we have in life, maybe apart from sleeping. That might come second. And I think it's a bit strange that we tend to think about work as something that we have to do, which we should not do, because leisure, free time, that's the aim of life. And then there is something nasty like work that we have to do. I think that's a strange way of looking upon the most important thing that we do in our lives.
Well, that's wonderful. Before we drill down into that, what's the name of the book for people that want to go and read it?
The book is called The Story of Work, A New History of Humankind.
Wonderful. So I would imagine if you're going back to the very earliest days of humanity, work was about survival. Literally, I would imagine it was about gathering enough resources to survive in the environment. Was it? Or do we have any evidence of what work was back at the very early days, and then how you would define work?
Maybe a definition first, because that's very crucial to the book.
Okay.
So to start with the negative, it's not just about the male industrial worker earning a wage. It's about all useful work, especially including household work. So taking care of the food, taking care of the children, and so including in that way not only men but also women. Also, if they don't earn a wage for what they do, that does not mean that what they do is less important than what wage earners do, or employers do, or independent producers do. So it's a very wide definition of work that I apply. And while writing the book, I've become more and more convinced that this is the right approach, because otherwise it's just very accidental what you include and what you don't include. And because it has basically to do with how workers being remunerated. And the other aspect of it is that you have immediately, as a unit of analysis, not only the individual person working, but the household, because that's the basis of all our cooperation, whether we earn money for it, yes or no. And then the first part of your question, then going back to the beginning of our existence as humans. Yes, it's pure necessity, but don't forget it's also a necessity at this very moment. Imagine that you and me and everybody would stop working for, let's say, 1 or 2 weeks. We all would be dead. We would be dead completely. There would be no distribution. There would be nothing in the shops. The tap would not be running. The electricity would not work. It would be the end of humankind very, very quickly. So necessity is a basis of work. But having said that, that's not all. There is also pleasure in work. I think that's very important. And you just said, what's the evidence? Most important evidence for us as historians, of course, because by excavating, we can't see what our forefathers and foremothers did and thought hundreds of thousands of years ago. But we have the analogy of anthropology. And anthropologists over the last centuries have very intensively studied hunter-gatherers, as they are called. And our hunting-gathering period in our history, that's 98% of our history, that we have been hunter-gatherers. So it's very important to know how such societies were organized as to work. And then you see it's a lot of work to hunt and to gather and to maintain your existence in that way. But at the same time, that's not the whole story. You see also that people like it. Well, of course, not all. We do not like all of our work, but we also don't hate all our work. Otherwise, it would be impossible to perform anything. And the pleasure, the fun is, I think, basically in not only achieving something, but that the other members of your household or of a small tribe recognizes your achievements. Because we only can be proud if others let us be proud. Otherwise, it's nothing. It's just staring in a mirror, congratulating ourselves. But that's of course, crazy in the end.
Well, one of the interesting things I think about the hunter-gatherer society is that it's defined by finding resources that are there and bringing them back.
True.
And I believe that that's the sort of period before agriculture. And agriculture is defined as creating those resources more locally and then gathering them. So one is a sort of almost passive finding of resources, which, as you say, I think is the vast tract of human existence has been going out and finding things where they happen to grow, where they happen to be. And only recently, and by recently I mean the last few thousands of years, have human beings settled, grown, and kind of created their own resources in the local area. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, true. But I think if you call a hunting-gathering passive, then you risk to make these people, well, like stupid, dull, just fine. Because especially hunting, that's not passive at all.
Yes, I suppose I used the wrong word there. By passive, I mean there are things in the environment you go out to find,
True.
and it takes a lot of skill and a lot of energy and
True.
a lot of luck and randomness in it as well. I believe hunting in particular in hunter-gatherer societies these days is one of those rich reward but often failure kind of high risk, high reward situations, especially hunting big game. And then if you think about some of the creatures that early man in the Paleolithic must have been hunting, like some of the giant creatures, which if you work with big animals like horses, you know how dangerous they can be, let alone dogs. You think of something that's twice as big as a horse that wants to kill you as well.
Yeah.
That's actually quite a dramatic fight you're going to have with a creature there. But then agriculture comes along, and I wonder, I mean, work then starts to become a different thing. It's almost as if I would imagine the hunter-gatherer, work and existence are intertwined. They're all part of the same kind of thing. And then does your book I'm sure it does, but the idea that suddenly you're working in a location repeatedly, doing things seasonally, and potentially working for somebody else. When did people start working for somebody else in human history?
That's later, but as to the difference between agriculturists and hunter-gatherers, the difference is mainly, I think, in the size of the community, because farmers work as households. And there is much, of course, there is cooperation between households of farmers. Let's say in harvest time, then you help each other out and so on. But basically, it's much more concentrated in a household. So it's a smaller unit than a band of hunter-gatherers. That's, I think, very important. And it also seems to imply that the division of tasks between men and women becomes much more prominent than among hunter-gatherers. Because hunter-gatherers, we have the idea that it's the man, the hunter, and the woman who gathers. But if you look, in fact, and that you were alluding to it, when you hunt big game, you can't do it on your own. Also not with 2 or 3 men. The entire community has to chase the game into a position where it really can be killed. It can be hunted into a cave or whatever. So only a big community, so several households together can do that hunting. And agriculture can be done in smaller units. I think that's an important difference. And then when do people start to work for others, let's say in a subordinate position, let's say working for members of other families, because that's what it basically is. That's only possible when you have enough specialization, and that's only possible when you have substantial surplus in agriculture, and especially among herders. There you can have, let's say, a kind of accumulation of goods and a surplus. And then if there is a surplus, it enables you to have people who do not take care of their own food, but become, let's say, a carpenter or smith or something else, and have to rely on the food produced by farmers. And then, of course, you get an exchange. Well, if you have that at a level of that, you can have cities and states. So cities from, let's say, starts from 5000 BCE and states 2300 BCE. Then you can have a situation in which you have so many specialists that society has to be organized. It's not, let's say, a collection of small farms, of peasants, but it has to be organized. And then you have different types of organization. So you can have city organization, which I describe, state organization, and in the end, markets. And each of these types, they have their specific kinds of dependent workers. In a city, especially the old Mesopotamian city-states, there the organization of work was around the temple. So let's say everybody works for a god. But of course, there are some people who are more near to the god than others. So
Yes.
These are the priests. And they collect the surpluses and they redistribute it among people who do not farm. You might say basically. And of course, they take themselves the largest share, clearly. In states, there you see something very interesting. And there you see that for the first time, really dependent labor, because states are able to organize armies and to fight other states. That's what basically is new about states. And then the big choice is, imagine that you have won. What do you do with the enemy? Do you kill it, which you can, or do you let them work for yourself? And then, you make them into slaves. So slavery is the first kind of dependent labor. So before there is wage labor, there was slave labor. And that's what you see in all big states, that they organize dependent labor in such a way.
That's interesting, because you've got working animals as well. I would imagine that the animals work as well. But that's absolutely fascinating that slave labor probably is one of the earliest forms for other people in many ways. You know, as you say, what do you do when you conquer? If you've got spare resources, you've got enough to feed an army who aren't growing food themselves. They defeat somebody, kill some people, but capture lots of other people. What do you do with that resource now? Those human beings require food to eat, but you don't want to integrate them.
So then they have to produce.
Yes.
You are not just putting them in prison and feeding them, and that would be crazy. And besides, it would be completely impossible, of course. Mm. So you can put them to work in several ways. You can put them as a group in the wild nature to colonize a plot, or you can distribute them among farmers to work for individual farmers. You even can organize them as armies, which sometimes happens. You have slave armies in the past.
I've always been fascinated by the concept of slave army, because you think if you arm slaves and teach them how to fight and organize
Yeah.
them. You think, why are they still slaves then? How does that work? What's the human psychology behind that? And I don't know.
Well, maybe we don't have to discuss this at length now, but it's especially when you capture young boys
Ah,
and then you discipline them into an army. And then, let's say, if you allow them to have children, these might become soldiers again. And then you have a very dedicated force, which is because you have you have conquered them, and you have they are your property. They are loose from any other society.
right.
And then you even might give them certain privileges. So that then it is you have a parallel in these child soldiers that you hear of sometimes. They're also completely loose of their own family, completely isolated, and then then you force them initially, of course, to fight for you and to kill for you and so on. But it's especially it's an isolated crowd that you manage.
That's a topic we should probably avoid going into for now, but maybe it's something we can look at other. I wanted to get back to animals because one of the things that I'm aware of, I'm particularly interested in the medieval period, and one of the things I think a lot of people that talk about the medieval period from a modern perspective is how many animals there would have been around a household. The animals living and breeding, dying, being killed, being eaten, but also doing work.
True. Yeah.
And can you expand upon that a little bit?
Well, you have working animals. If you make the parallel with humans, you have animals working for themselves, like virtually all wild animals, organizing food collectioning among themselves. And you have animals working for other animals, particularly what we are talking about now, let's say horses who work for humans, pigs, cows, camels, and so on and so forth. And there you have, I've described it not at length in my book, but I've discussed a little bit. There you have different types of domestication. You have animals who come to humans, especially dogs. That is, they have not been tamed by humans, but it's thought that they have come to humans. And then that's one. You may tame animals, and then the offspring also becomes tame. And you have animals that you have to tame each time, like elephants. Let's say babies of tamed elephants are not tamed elephants. They have to be taken out of nature each time and each time they have to be trained.
Oh, that's fascinating. I never knew that about elephants, yes.
And the same also goes, I think, for hyenas and animals working for humans, and not only in order to be slaughtered, but in all other ways. That's, of course, a very important part of human history, because it's just before the machinery, let's say machinery, wind-driven or water-driven. We depended to a great extent of animals. And it also gave some populations, like the Yamnaya that I described in southern Russia, it gave them a big advantage over others, to such an extent that they have conquered big parts of Western Europe. And David Reich, he thinks that by analysis of DNA, he can demonstrate what these people have done, that they have killed their male enemies, and they have taken care that their offspring came from the women. So they have just taken the women and killed the men. And that was because, and that's how we come to it, because they were the first ones to tame horses. And then later on, they sold horses to the south, to Mesopotamia. And it's a long story, but it's a very gruesome story. But that's also a variety of organizing work. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the origins of horse training, because I have a vague notion that it might have been children that first were playing with the herds and following them as pets and climbing around them as children do. realised that it was quite fun to ride a horse and you could make it go in a certain direction or train it to go. And I always wonder whether horse riding comes from children's play as much as any adult suddenly going, let's try and ride that horse. I wonder about history, about discoveries like that,
I haven't come across this, but big authorities are a man called Anthony, who has written all about the Yamnaya and the horses, and also a man called Khazanov, a Russian specialist in animal farming and especially herding and so on. But they don't mention this idea of yours. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I've not come across it.
I've not studied it at all. It's just I'm very aware how inquisitive and unthreatened by things like horses children are. I have to, when I've got children around my horses, I always have to be careful. A horse can be dangerous. And I realize I'm setting up fears in their head. Whereas before, they wouldn't. They'd clamber over them. And if the horse is good-natured, the horse just ignores them. I always felt that might be a plausible way where people went, hang on, you can sit on a horse and do something with it. And I don't think there was probably ever a time when there must have been a time when the first human being sat on the first horse.
Yeah.
But whether it then spread from there or whether it happened simultaneously in many places or roughly, when did these things start,
Yeah, between 5,000 and 4,000 BCE in southern Russia and the southern Russian plains.
Mm-hmm.
These people had a big advantage, not only because of the horses they could tame, but also because of the metals they could find in the Urals, and because of the endless supply of salmon and other fish in the Dnieper and the Dniester and so on. So it was a combination of natural advantages which they've played out, and they are at the basis of the Indo-European society.
That's quite a long time ago. So that predates the Mongols by many thousands of years.
Many thousand years.
Yes. Yeah. I'm going to have to look into that whole period because, of course, the origins of horsemanship, I'm fascinated by it. And it's gone in lots of different directions as well, and how big horses are. And, of course, it comes down to spare resources, doesn't it? Because it's something you mentioned right at the very beginning, which is once you have spare resources, once you have an excess, you can have specialists. You could have somebody training horses professionally.
Yeah, what these horses, what I also described, but that's much later, let's say for the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. I quote a proverb in India, which says, horses from the north and slaves from the south. So it is, especially in tropical regions, it's very hard to raise horses. So the more south you come, the more you are dependent on importing horses from the north. That goes for Africa, that goes for Central Asia. And then, of course, the horses have to be paid. And one of the ways of paying them was by exporting slaves from northern India to Central Asia.
Oh, so they swapped slaves for horses?
Well, maybe not necessarily directly 10 slaves to one horse or something like that. But in fact, if you think about exports and imports, that's basically what happened.
So I wanted to get back a little bit to cooperation, and you touched on cooperation a bit, and we talked about households. So I presume a household has a typical makeup from your perspective. How would you describe what you would describe as a household?
Well, a household is income pooling and unit, and mostly of the time it also means that you consume together on a daily basis. Not always, of course, because members of the household can be away for some time as temporal migrant laborers and so on. But basically, that's what it is. And you have the age differences. Of course, it's also a training unit, you might say. And it's interesting that at a certain point in time, then comes the moment when either children leave the household to join another household, or that members of other households come in as brides or grooms. And there you have the different systems in the world where either the women go to the household of their husbands and become subservient to their in-laws. India is a good example of this. or men leave the household and become members of the household of their brides. And in the first type, you see, it seems, I'm following anthropologists, much more inequality than in the other type.
So if women leave to join a household, that tends to generate more inequality.
Yeah, and especially if they leave, as in also the Indian case shows in the past, at a very early age, but also in China. So let's say at age 10, 11, 12, of course, then you haven't had a chance to develop yourself. And so from the authority of your father, you go under the authority of your father-in-law and also of your husband, who in those cases sometimes has a much older age. So then, let's say, boys of around 20 marry girls of around 10. And of course, thinking about work and to what extent can you determine the way you work, that has a big impact.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways. Because I was also thinking about the unit, the household, because it wouldn't necessarily be one man, one woman in some cases, would it?
Most of the time, that's the case.
Okay.
So let's say polyamorous, if there is any amor involved in it at all, is more of an exception.
Okay.
Yeah.
So so what we think of as the nuclear, what I think of as the nuclear family, one man, one woman, children, is a sort of fairly fundamental component of human society going back a long time.
Yeah, and as I said, it can be 3-generational, but of course that depends a lot on the life expectancy. When people do not grow very old, then there is not much chance for a multi-generational, or not for a very long period of multi-generational households.
I was interested in you talking about the priesthood, if you like, the very early city-states that were many thousands of years ago. About, you said they were organized around the temple and the excess was given to the temple, and the priests sort of claimed quite a lot of that excess for themselves, almost certainly. And that's the beginnings of hierarchy, isn't it? And politics, I suppose.
It is, at least it's a much higher degree of hierarchy than in households. And it is interesting to think of the way people could sustain it. Because in the hunter-gatherer society, there is a high degree of egalitarianism. There are not many big differences. Of course, there are some differences, but let's say in the group is small enough that they can check each other, that everybody does his or her best to a certain extent. And then you divide the food according to this. But it's not very easy in a small group to do nothing and just to get as much as from the others. You can imagine. In such societies as the earliest city-states, there is a bigger chance of inequality, especially that the top of society gets a bigger share. And then this grows a problem among, let's say, the common man. Why should Mr. Johnson get more than me? This is only possible if you have a shared ideology. And that's because it's not by accident that God is the center. And the ideology is that you produce for the God, not for the priest, but for the God, that if you have a shared ideology, that this gives meaning, it protects society, it's good for the commonwealth, then you can have such forms of still limited, but still inequality. And that's very much in general. There are two ways of a sustainable, unequal society. One is force, let's say like apartheid or concentration camps and so on, brute force. But that is, of course, not very sustainable in the long run. And the other is an ideology which tells you that this is good. You might think that inequality is wrong, but in the end, it's good because, and then you can fill it out yourself.
With a god or a power or some kind of entity
or even, let's say, in communist Russia, where the elite had, of course, a lot of privileges. This was good because society as such was good, and they were making sure that society went into the right direction. And of course, another alternative is what we have in our society, which we call a capitalist society, that we say, well, there is inequality, but why is this so? Not because we want inequality. No, it's the outcome of the market process, and it's good because it makes people do their best, etc. So as such, it's not good, but in the end, we need to have stories, what I call ideologies, but that it has to be a shared ideology which makes it possible to have inequality again, unless you use brute force and you have a kinds of slave societies and so on.
I was going to ask a little bit about the medieval period, my area of particular interest, but it's a vast, especially, I talk about medieval, I tend to talk about medieval England, which is a tiny, tiny part of it.
Uh-huh.
But the medieval period I think was fairly interesting because it was post-Roman, and the Romans were very organized. I mean, the more you study them, the more organized and systematic you think they were. And they're almost modern in many ways in their level of organization and administration. And then it goes away, and we kind of almost, we freewheel downhill a little bit as a human society. So how would you contrast the Roman system of organizing work, for example, because they were a slave-based economy, I believe, mostly, I may be wrong there, with the sort of medieval period, which again, I think started out partly as slave-based, but quite rapidly transitions away from that, but into the peasanthood, into sort of people that weren't necessarily slaves per se, but were pretty close to it in many ways.
Yes, of course, that's a very important part of my book. Not only because you see it in, let's say, our part of the world, the transition from the Roman period to the early Middle Ages, but you see something similar in northern India. And the similarity between the two is that you have a highly monetized market economy before, let's say, until 400 AD. And the evidence, of course, is archaeological, that you have many small coins. So it's a deeply monetized economy where wage labor is very important in both cases, both India, northern India, and the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And then you see the emergence of a society with hardly any money. So let's say between 400 and 1100, especially without small money, without wage labor, I would say. So for that reason, and that's also what I argue in my book, classical society is a slave society, but much more as a market society. Anyway, cities stop, labor specialization stops, monetization stops. And then the alternative is basically a serf society where you have vast landscapes of small peasants, and the small surpluses that they make, because they are not specialized, so the surpluses are very small. These are not big latifundia, but all small farms. But the small surpluses they produce, they have to give to the nobility, which is a very primitive kind of nobility in terms of material welfare. And sometimes they have to assist in war making, which is also on a very small scale and very regional. And only around very roughly 1100, you see in Europe and also in India, the re-emergence of cities, the re-emergence of labor specialization, the re-emergence of coining and deep monetization of wage labor and so on.
Do we know why that happened? Because it's almost an apocalypse. I mean, people talk about, in science fiction, the apocalypse, collapse of society, but we haven't lived through it personally, but societies have come through an apocalypse. The collapse of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, anyway, must have been an apocalypse.
Yeah, it is even more amazing because it happens at roughly the same time. And in between, you have what we call, let's say, the Middle East, where it does not happen. In the Byzantine Empire, it does not happen. In the Sasanian Empire, it does not happen. In the Arab civilizations, it does not happen. To the contrary, there you have a long continuation of deep monetization, of urbanization, of labor specialization until far into the Middle Ages. So I haven't found a good explanation for it. I might have missed it, and I'm certainly not a specialist in this, but maybe I'm as equally amazed as you are. As I say, particularly because it's not only the story of Western Europe, there's a parallel in India.
I'd never realized that. Again, I'm going to have to look that up because you've almost got two areas there which are quite different in many ways, in terms of the environment and the way society is organized, but maybe there are more similarities. The idea that the overpinning of sort of civilization basically just went away. I mean, London, you can see from the archaeology that Roman London was almost abandoned, and people thought it was built by giants. They literally talked about it being haunted, and London still existed, but it was a little bit further down I think it might have been further upriver, and this sort of haunted ruins of what was left behind by giants.
Like Rome, right?
Yes.
The same, yeah? Let's say the medieval inhabitants of Rome, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century, yeah? They could just hide in a small corner of all these big buildings. Yeah?
Yes. It's definitely an area of history I want to explore more, because the idea of giants in the past and people building fantastic things probably starts back then, at least, if not before. But, seeing these massive things that you can't build anymore and wondering how the ancients had the money to build this fantastic building, and you're squatting in a corner with you've got pigs in the forum or whatever, and you're growing vegetables out the back where there used to be a bath.
Yeah.
And it took society an awfully long time to come back from that. I mean, as you say, money. I was reading about the Vikings, and there are some dinars that appear to have come from the Islamic world into...
Yeah, Islamic, but that's big money.
Yes, exactly.
You cannot use it for paying wages or for buying things in the shop and so on.
Yeah.
It basically has to be seen as hoarding.
Yes.
It's silver.
These are like somebody giving us a gold bar, and it's worth an awful lot, but you can't go to the local shop to spend it.
No, these are savings.
Yes. It's an area I'd like to explore more, but I think we're kind of running out of time here. I want to finish on the value of work. So in the medieval period, there was sort of lockdown on how much you could pay somebody for a day's work. Has there been a sort of, it's not monetary value, a kind of value of one human being's work, physical work in a day? Has that been relatively stable throughout much of history from a work perspective, or has it varied wildly?
It has varied indeed, because the lockdown you just alluded to, that's after the plague in Western Europe. Then there was a shortage of labor. And the laborers realized very well that this enabled them to ask more for their work. And that's what they did. And then you see, as a reaction, all over Europe, authorities in England, of course, the Statute of Labor and so on is the most well-known, but you have had such initiatives all over Europe to curb remuneration of labor.
It didn't work either, though, did it, really? I mean...
It did not really work. It worked to such an extent that you could force beggars to work for a boss for a minimum wage, and poor women and children and so on. But no, it did not work. The market was stronger. And in fact, talking about wage laborers, let's say from those periods onward, so let's say from 1100 onward, you see always this tension between the work that you do and the remuneration that you get. And this, I think, basic idea that there should be a fair remuneration. And if that is not happening, then you have two solutions. You might say that you have the market solution, which in fact is that you try to change boss, which you can do after the feudal period, or not only the boss in the town or village where you live, but you go to another city or another town, and that's urbanization. So that's migration is one of the main answers. And because urbanization depends totally on immigration, because cities in general have a negative natural outcome. So more people die in the city than they are born. So they depend on immigrants, especially to grow. So that's one. And the other is collective action. That if the, let's say, what I call the individual strategies don't work, then you might try collective strategies. And you see it in craftsman guilds and journeyman guilds and their actions. And of course, later on in trade unions and cooperatives, mutual benefit societies. Well, there are many, many, many forms. That is, for me, the great story of wage labor and the struggle to have decent remuneration. And that's the story, at least in this part of the world, for the last, let's say, 1,000 years or so.
Tension between the workers and the bosses.
Certainly tension between them, but also bosses. And now I'm not flattering you as a boss, but no, but there is a big tradition also in your country of bosses who see the problem and try to come up with more equal remunerations and curbing their own profits. And well, the Cadburys, Josiah Wedgwood, and there are many, many of such initiatives. And in fact, of course, the cooperation of employers in the emergence of welfare states. Of course, some employers were radically against it, but they could not, after the First and the Second World War, they were not able to hold it up. But that's also a caricature. There's also an awareness among employers that if only to have a sustainable society, that chasing profits cannot be the only solution, although, let's say, a purely liberal interpretation of market society asks for this.
Yes, I mean, that's the difference between short-term and long-term thinking from in a business. The short-term gain might be quite big, but medium to long-term, you collapse your company and actually the net value of that decision is much worse.
Yeah.
Ultimately, and therefore the correct decision is the medium to long term positive decision.
Yeah, and that's the history of the last 40 years. The big turn around 1970s, 1980s, where we have been trying this liberal model. And if I'm not mistaken, we are now again at a point where a lot of people ask themselves, well, was this so wise? And is this how we have to continue? Also because of environmental reasons, of course. That's quite a different and not unimportant argument.
And massive impacts. I think that this pandemic that we're still going through, hopefully towards the end of it, but nonetheless still firmly in I think, society-changing historical event that we're actually living through. I think there will be ramifications from changing work patterns that will echo for many, many decades ahead. I've certainly noticed it amongst people I work with. People are changing the sort of work patterns which almost came from the Industrial Revolution, that you've got to be at the factory at 8, you work and you stop at 5. And people are flexing those hours. They're probably doing as many hours work, but they're voluntarily flexing it. And this whole concept of work and leisure, which we started with, is sort of almost more integrated in that work isn't something you'd prefer not to be doing. Work is part of your daily routine, and you can merge it with what might be called leisure. If you're lucky enough to work in a creative industry, for example, like the computer games making, it's going to be fascinating in decades to look back.
Yeah, that's one aspect of it. The other, of course, is the balance between what they call reproductive work and productive work in the household. And a third aspect, and that is that we used to cooperate. And as in the beginning of our conversation, I explained that I think that gives meaning to our work. But then we have to work also physically with others. And so even if technically it were possible that we do everything on our own and be more productive and so on, it would give, in the end, much less satisfaction. So how to find a balance between real and also physical cooperation, which is important also for our self-esteem, and, let's say, the technical possibilities which were already there, but which we have discovered now in the corona pandemic. Yeah.
Where do you think, if you were to imagine 50 years from now, where do you think the work will fit in the sort of history of how we've seen work? Can you imagine us entering a post-work phase with so much spare resource, or can you see it going the other way, or could it do both?
Well, I think you can observe that if you take households and couples as a unit, they work now more hours for money than they used to do 40 years ago. A lot of housewives were not engaged in the labor market, and now most women are. And the gains are not so big since 40 years. So we are making more hours, especially in this part of the world. And there are several reasons for it. I think one is the income inequality, that's clear. But also, we have become dependent on a lot of work in the health service. Many, many more people are working, let's say, as a percentage of the total occupational population in health. And our average age is going to grow as well. Then, let's say, the globalization of connections, the effect of it is that the distance between producers and consumers is immense now. Imagine all the stuff that's coming from China and that's now upholded somewhere in the Suez Canal. We don't have chips for the cars because, well, et cetera, et cetera. The effect of it is that you need to have a lot of people who are checking all the phases in between and the controllers. And what I call in my book, the controllers of the controllers of the controllers. Think of this baby power scandal in China. As soon as you have a food scandal, then we say, oh, there should be an authority to check it. Why haven't we seen it? So we are endlessly, because the links between us humans have become so long, in order to be sure that we get the stuff or the service that we want to, and that there's no abuse, a lot more of jobs are being created. And then the third reason is the need of education. We have been talking about permanent education, education permanente. And that means that more and more people are involved in education. So on the one hand, we are, let's say, losing jobs because of mechanization, robotization, etc. On the other hand, we are massively creating jobs. And not maybe conscientiously, but that's what's happening. You see the shifts in the occupational censuses. And I think this also answers our innate need to work because we gain significance out of work. It's not only, let's say, kind of a technical equation which makes us lose some work and gain other work. We also like it. And that's I think, with my limited brains, of course, I think it's very unlikely that work will vanish and also that it will vanish quickly. We have had predictions from Jules Verne and from the mid-19th century, all predicting that within 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years, all work would be done by machines and we would all be riding bicycles, playing games, and that would fulfill us. I don't think so. I don't think that evolutionary, that is how we humans are built. But if you ask me what I think, what will be the development, that's one thing what I think of. The other is, of course, this crucial fact of fair remuneration. And there we have now, since 20, 30 years, you see a world emerging with competing value systems. We have, let's say, Western Europe, we have America, we have Russia, we have China, possibly India, and they all have different ideas about this crucial aspect. And so I think there will be a competition between these systems. And of course, I hope that the most fair one will prevail, but I'm not sure at all. I mean, we have seen such massive disasters in the history of the last 100 years that we cannot simply be too optimistic. I'm also not a pessimist, but I see this competition now. And you see it now also in the European Union, that gradually the emphasis on the market, which will solve everything. As long as we have a smooth market, then we all will be able to buy everything and we will be the most happy citizens of this world. I think that is too narrow a definition. That we need more ideals. And I think ideals of fairness, you see them coming back. To what extent, I don't know. There ends my function as a historian. I can only see what has happened. But I'm willing to speculate, but this is no longer academic.
Exactly. Speculation is fascinating, especially if you base it on knowledge from the past. But of course, who knows? And that's the excitement, in a way, of the future, and also the fun of studying the past, when you can start to see things repeating, or you can see things where you go, wow, that must have been terrifying situation to live through, and it's really interesting to study, but if you were there at the time, it must have been awful. We've chatted for a long time, and thank you so much for having conversation with me, Jan. I really appreciate it. It's been a delight. And your book again, for people that want to find out more about it?
Yeah, it has been published by Yale, and it's The Story of Work, A New History of Humankind.
Wonderful. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason, for the opportunity.